actually feel terror. I would just brace myself for what I knew was coming. I knew I was going to get screamed at and called a fucking loser who wasn't good for anything, would never amount to anything other than a stupid fucking whore. I started gaining weight at this point. I come from an overweight family. There's no way to get around that, but there were a lot of extenuating circumstances as well. Food was a simple way to self-soothe when my soul was injured and raw. After a brutal assault, I could retreat to my room, dip into my stash, and relax. Food and safety went hand in hand. If my room was messy, which, I mean, if you know me, obviously it was messy, he would tell me to make sure I never had children because the health department would take them away from me. Then he would make some snide remark about how since I was a fat fucking dyke, I wasn't going to have kids anyway. Sometimes I would come home and go up to my room to find it completely trashed. Drawers taken out of my dresser and dumped on the floor, the contents of my desk and bookcase strewn about, etc. And then I'd be blamed for the mess and screamed at until I cleaned it up. The worst times were when I'd get home and find he had thrown many of my things into black trash bags and set them on the curb. Anytime I walked into the kitchen for anything, I'd be able to hear him get up from his desk, where he constantly played online poker, and hear him walk down the hallway until he got to the kitchen. He would stand in the doorway with his arms crossed and stare at me. If I got a plate out, he'd tell me I couldn't use it because I would never wash it right. When I did try to wash a dish I had used, first rinsing it in the sink and then putting it in the dishwasher, he'd come directly behind me, take it out, redo everything, and comment on how fucking useless I was that I couldn't even wash a dish right. If I got any food out of the pantry or anything, he would say things like, "Yeah, that's what you really need, fat ass. Just keep eating." Every day. Every day, I was at once a fucking whore who was constantly fucking everyone because of my daddy issues and turning tricks on the corner, while simultaneously being a fat, ugly dyke who could never get a man. In junior high, he told me that he knew I would get on the Greyhound and go into Houston every day and turn tricks. He actually thought that in junior high, I was a hooker. Every single day was a battle for my sanity. I never contemplated suicide, but I did routinely contemplate homicide. I did cut a few times, but I never wanted to die. I knew I was not the problem. But I can't tell you how many times in the middle of the night I would just find myself standing outside his bedroom with a big kitchen knife. I know I would have gotten away with it. Everyone knew that he treated me like shit, and I knew I could claim self-defense and I would get away with it, but I could never do that to my mom. I always figured I was protecting her by keeping my mouth shut, but I don't think she ever knew the extent of what I went through, and I kind of really hope that she doesn't listen to this, and that my immediate family doesn't listen to this, because I think it might be a rude awakening, but I don't even know that they'd believe me, so. Moving on. It took me years to realize that it was just him being jealous and needing to control everything around him. At a certain point, I just decided to remove myself from the equation. I figured since I was the lightning rod for the abuse, that if I left, it would make things easier for the rest of my family. So when I was 20, my grandmother, had offered several times over the years for me to come live with her in Delaware, and I never took her up on it. But it got to the point where most of my friends had moved away for college, and I was essentially alone all the time, and went through a pretty deep depression. It was pretty bad. So I decided to move and get a fresh start. And I figured that me leaving would make things easier on my mom and my brother. But that did not happen. So 6 years after I moved up here in 2009, 5 or 6 years later, he ended up trying to strangle my mom. My brother pulled him off of her, beat the shit out of him, and called the cops, and he was arrested. He was charged with assault by choking, or impeding breathing. and he was convicted of it, but served no time and only had to pay a fine of $1,262. He and my mom split up. He moved to Las Vegas, and eventually my mom and brother moved up here to Delaware a couple years later with the rest of us. So something good did come up at that, and we're all together again. We all have our battle scars, but we're at least all together. Speaking of scars, I got out of that with I have no physical scars, thank God. Very few emotional scars. I know I'm shaky when I'm telling you a story, but it's just really hard putting myself back in that mindset. I've always been able to compartmentalize better than most. Occasionally things break through, but like for instance, it's funny because my ex is gonna totally know this, but it took me a long time to be okay with anyone being in my room or touching my things. So when my ex moved in, it was it was jarring. There was a boy in my things all the time, and always touching my things, and I had to move my things to make room for his things, and it was a very I was very territorial, so it took me a long time to get over that. And I know that's because I had no control over my belongings. I still feel like I'm gonna get screamed at or hurt if I do something wrong. I still cringe if I'm with someone I'm dating, or a man in general, and I spill anything. If I'm in my room and I hear a car pull up outside, I brace myself still, and then I have to remind myself that I no longer live in the same house as he does. And if I ever see a big black pickup truck with a truck cap, I always have to look at the license plate to make sure it's not his, and the driver to make sure it's not him. I know it's irrational, but it's not anything I have control over. So, I know my situation was bad, and I know experiences shouldn't be compared, but a lot of people had it much, much worse than I did. I read books about abuse, such as A Child Called It, Define Normal, and a story online called Becca the Beast, which honestly I started reading because it was on an erotic literature site, and it looked like a fun lesbian story, but it's one of the most well-written stories I've ever read, and it's primarily about abuse and rehabilitation. Reading about people who had worse experiences than me gave me strength. A Child Called It was rough. It was my first foray into those kinds of stories. It's the most famous account of child abuse. It was written by Dave Pelzer in 1995, and chronicles his hellish childhood at the hands of his violently abusive and neglectful mother. It got me through some pretty dark times. That's probably surprising if you've read it, or if you ever do, because it is absolutely not a feel-good story. But I knew that if he could get through that and, get to the point where he could write and publish it, obviously he got out and was able to live some sort of life. If he could do that, then I had no excuse. I had to keep going. So trauma and abuse don't really begin to describe what he went through. He was starved until he was finally fed spoiled table scraps or leftover milk from his brother's breakfast cereal. He was locked in a bathroom with bleach and ammonia fumes burning his airways. He had his arm held over a stove burner until he blistered. There's just a few of the many, many, many stories chronicled in that book. Torture is a far more accurate way to describe that. Now, there is some speculation that the events detailed in the novel were made up, or at the very least exaggerated, but there's no question that at the time I read it, it was fact to me. And even if it was fabricated, there are plenty of true stories that come to light far too often in the news that are corroborated by police reports. One of them involves Elisa Izquierdo. I'm just going to advise you now, this is a horrible, horrible story. And, way, way worse than what I've already talked about. So if you don't want to listen, now's a good time to turn it off. So Elisa Izquierdo was a 6-year-old Puerto Rican and Cuban American girl. Her mom was Awilda Lopez. And between the years of 94 and 95, at the ages of 5 and 6, She endured horrible physical, mental, and emotional abuse inflicted upon by her mother. She actually had a really good life up until age 4. She went to preschool, a wonderful private preschool. She lived with her father, who was wonderful. He didn't have any kids before her, but he did everything he could. Gustavo, he did everything he could to give her the best possible life. Her mom was a crack addict, and Elisa was born addicted to crack cocaine. But because of her mom's addiction, custody was given to Gustavo, so that was one good thing. He ended up sending her to a really, really nice school, and one of the school's patrons was Prince Michael of Greece. So he ended up meeting Elisa and loved her, and ended up paying her tuition at the Brooklyn Friends School until 12th grade. He prepaid all of her tuition. And she would thank him by drawing him pictures or writing him little notes. So, her mom was actually awarded partial custody at this point once she kicked her habit. And she lobbied for unsupervised visits and got them. But every time Elisa would come back from her mother, she'd be covered in bruises. She started wetting the bed. She lost control of her bowels. She was always very nervous. And she would tell her dad that her mom would hit her repeatedly and lock her in cupboards. And she told her dad that she did not want to go back. One of the places that these injuries were found were her genitalia. So clearly there was something horrible going on. She would always vomit and refuse to enter bathrooms when she came back from her mother's. Her dad and her teachers did let authorities know that she was being abused. Elisa told a social worker, and her father in 1992 applied to have the visitation rights removed from the mother, but the courts ruled the visitation could continue. But they said that for them to continue, Iwilda must not strike or harm her daughter. So a year later, Gustavo decided that he was going to take Elisa and move back to Cuba. He purchased airline tickets, and the travel date was May 26, 1994. Earlier that month in May, before they were able to leave, Gustavo was admitted to the hospital. He was having trouble breathing, and he was diagnosed as having lung cancer, and he ended up dying on May 26th, the same day that they were supposed to leave for Cuba. Once the director of Elisa's school found out that her dad had died and she would likely be put back into the custody of her mother, her name's Phyllis Bryce. The director did go contact a judge saying that she should not be given to the mother because of the history of abuse. Iwilda did apply for full custody. She was granted temporary custody, and family members did come forward and say that she should in no way be given the rights of this child. People tried. The head teacher of her school, and Prince Michael of Greece wrote personal letters to the judge ruling over the case, saying that Iwilda should not have permanent custody. And because none of these people had sufficient money to pay their legal fees, they didn't get anywhere. And her mother ended up having the support of the Legal Aid Society and a federally funded parenting program. So they testified that she had made valiant efforts to refrain from relapsing to drug use, and and they lied and said that caseworkers had visited the house and that Elisa had said that she wanted to live with her mom. They also attacked the family members for having the nerve to try to take Elisa from her mother. And they replied that the nerve was born out of fear of Elisa being placed